The beginning of days, a response to
Jeremy D. Lyon's
Genesis 1, 1-3, and the literary boundary of day 1.
Jeremy D. Lyon,
In his essay, Genesis 1, 1-3, and the literary boundary of day 1, claimed that Genesis chapter 1, verses 1-2 is meant to be read as part of day 1, and that this interpretation, quote, reflects the grammar and syntax in the most straightforward manner, and is supported by, quote, intertextual commentary, that is, other parts of the Bible. He helpfully focuses on the most crucial issue for young earth creationists, whether Genesis 1 allows for long periods of time between the creation ex nihilo, out of nothing, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and the beginning of the days in chapter 1, verse 3. Following the work of Weston Fields,
Lyon
offers a grammatically impressive defense of a crucial issue for defending young earth creationism, that's YEC, that Genesis 1, 1-2 is a circumstantial, that is, that it describes the circumstances at the dawn of day 1. However, his conclusion about the circumstantial clauses of Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 is overly narrow. Further,
Lyon
scarcely touches on the literary device demarcating the onset of each day, the "and God said" refrain, and doesn't deal with the scene-setting grammar and vocabulary of the first 2 verses, or the vav consecutive beginning chapter 1, verse 3, or the different terms, create versus make, as bara versus asa, between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, and chapter 31, verse 17. These crucial omissions mean that
Lyon
fails to prove his claims.
Jeremy D. Lyon
In a 2019 essay in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, proffered an interpretation of Genesis 1 that begins day 1 at the first verse. He called this the, quote, traditional interpretation, and claimed it, quote, reflects the grammar in the most straightforward manner and is supported by intertextual commentary. It is the standard interpretation for young earth creationists, YECists, like Ken Ham and John MacArthur. The key question: would an unindoctrinated reader in the original audience Genesis was intended for read Genesis 1 as beginning day 1 in verse 1? By unindoctrinated, I don't mean presuppositionless, as no such reader exists. I mean the average reader or hearer for which Genesis was intended. Does the author intend us to see the first 2 verses of Genesis as describing day 1? Does Genesis, in that way, create an unbroken, datable, chronological sequence back to creation?
Lyon
And the YECists insist that it does. Does their interpretation stand up to scrutiny? The place to begin is at the beginning. Many readers assume that the key to the debate is the meaning of day, but this begs the question as to whether Genesis chapter 1, verses 1-2 is part of day 1. Until that issue is settled, debating the meaning of day is premature. The first crucial question: when does day 1 begin? Thankfully, this is the question that
Lyon
grapples with. Like Luther wrote to Erasmus,
Lyon
is to be praised and commended highly for attacking the real issue, the essence of the matter in dispute, and not wearying us with trifles. In this debate, the definition of yom, or day, would be a trifle between young earth and old earth creationism until we settle whether the first 2 verses preface day 1 or are part of it. Begin at the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. That's the first sentence our imaginary, unindoctrinated reader would see.
Lyon
Claims that the traditional and, quote, straightforward reading of this verse is that it begins day 1.
Lyon
This interpretation achieves for young earth creationists an unbroken chronological sequence all the way back to the original creation of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, which is essential to it.
Lyon
Concludes, quote, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 is an independent clause depicting God's initial creative act, creatio ex nihilo, on day 1. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 is a description of the state or condition of the earth as it was originally created. Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 then moves the narration forward. Thus, the first 5 verses, Genesis chapter 1, verses 1-5, constitute the creative acts of day 1. The text does not allow for the possibility of pre-existent matter or an undisclosed period of time prior to day one. There is a major literary marker that we can assume our unindoctrinated reader would immediately notice. The refrain that introduces each day occurs in verse 3. Genesis chapter 1 verse 3 doesn't simply move the narration forward. It opens with a refrain, a literary device that marks it off. And he said. Each of the days is demarcated by a refrain with, and God said, beginning each day. And it was evening, and it was morning, the nth day, concluding, except for the seventh. Because we're looking for the literary boundary of day one, we cannot dismiss such an obvious boundary marker. Since every day is begun with the refrain, consistency suggests that the writer intends to show us that day one begins with, and God said. In verse 3, there is no literary reason why verse 1 could not have begun with God said if the intention was to communicate that verses 1 and 2 are part of day 1. In a detailed essay on this issue, it's notable that
Lyon
does not substantially deal with the introductory portion of the refrain. He fills 3 pages demonstrating the paragraph divisions of the Qumran text compared to the Masoretic, and an entire section on the commentary of ancient Jewish literature, but confines his exegesis of the refrain that opens each day to 2 sentences in the footnotes. He notes that John Collins bases his conclusions on the fact that the first Wayiktol verb, then he said, occurs in chapter 1 verse 3, and that the following workdays of creation week, days 2 to 6, begins with the same Wayiktol verb. He notes that the ending of every day is demarcated by, and there was evening and there was morning, the nth day, but dismisses the idea that the phrase that consistently marks the beginning of every other day also marks the beginning of day one. He states, quote, the fact that each of the subsequent workdays of creation week begin with the Wayiktol verb, then he said, does not necessarily mean that day one must also begin with the Wayiktol verb, then he said, in chapter 1, verse 3. He reasons that this is the case because, quote, within the narrative, Wayomer, and he said, occurs in several places other than the beginning of a day. Chapter 1, verse 11, verse 26, and verse 29, unquote. This is dubious reasoning. Just because the and God said refrain is used at other places, each significant creative acts, than just the beginning of the days, doesn't mean that the refrain still doesn't mark the beginning of each creation day, because Wayomer, and he said, is also used to mark the immensely important creative events of vegetation, chapter 1, verse 11, humanity, chapter 1, verse 26, and food for humanity, in chapter 1, verse 29, doesn't alter the fact that it also is the literary boundary marker for the beginning of each of the other days. Should we conclude that it is also serving that purpose for the first day? That is, every other day in the creation week is begun with the literary marker, and God said. In order to show that chapter 1, verses 1 to 2 is part of day 1,
Lyon
must show why day 1 is an exception to this rule. He doesn't. The vovs, disjunctive and consecutive. A major part of
Lyon's
case is his exegesis of the Hebrew conjunction beginning verse 2, the vav, usually translated as and. Quote, the construction of the vav plus a noun is known as a vav disjunctive, which does not convey sequence, but a condition. In other words, the opening clause of verse 2 is functioning as a parenthetical description or background information concerning the earth as initially created in verse 1. Unquote. Hence, he concludes on the basis of this vav disjunctive that, quote, Hebrew grammar does not allow for the insertion of vast periods of time between chapter 1, verse 1 and chapter 1, verse 2. Unquote.
Lyon
Here appears to be carrying on the work from a generation earlier of Weston Fields. Fields also strove to provide the academic foundations for young earth creationists to show that Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 2 is part of day 1. In his book, Unformed and Unfilled, he sought to close any possibility for long intervals between the initial creation and the beginning of day one. That is, like
Lyon,
he tried to exclude the gap theory as a viable interpretation of Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 2. The gap theory posits that there is a lengthy, undefined interval of time between the initial creation in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and the dawn of day 1 in chapter 1, verse 3. It was popularized by Thomas Chalmers, who lived from 1780 to 1847, a professor at the University of Edinburgh and founder of the Free Church of Scotland. The gap theory was part of the original Scofield Reference Bible in 1909. It was more recently propagated by Arthur C. Constance, lived from 1910 to 1985, a Canadian anthropologist, biblical archaeologist, and Hebrew scholar who wrote Without Form and Void in 1970. Constance's gap theory claims there is an epoch between chapter 1 verse 1 and chapter 1 verse 2. Fields responded by describing the conjunction beginning Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 as a vav attached to a noun, for example, and the earth, usually interpreted as a vav disjunctive, which may indicate the background or circumstances of the main verb. John Goldingay, referring to verse 2, notes that this is, quote, a normal view that those are disjunctive vavs, unquote. It may indicate that the action is simultaneous or parenthetical material to the main verb. For example, and the earth was without form, etc., while God said the first command, the fiat, let there be light, that begins day 1. It is in contrast to the vav consecutive, which is attached to a verb, for example, and God said. And as we'll see, is usually translated simply as and. Fields sought to show that the vav disjunctive opening chapter 1 verse 2 prohibits any length of time between chapter 1 verse 1 and chapter 1 verse 2, and by implication attaches chapter 1 verses 1 to 2 to chapter 1 verse 3, and thus day 1. However, there are several problems with
Lyon's
narrower interpretation of vav in Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 to 2. First, as Leslie Allen has noted, vav is so flexible in its meaning that it's not possible to interpret it so technically and specifically. Brown Driver Briggs, a Hebrew dictionary, notes that the vav is, quote, used freely and widely in Hebrew, but also with much delicacy to express relations and shades of meaning which Western languages would usually indicate by distinct particles, unquote. How we determine what shade of meaning the vav might carry is a matter of context and interpretation. It should be interpreted contextually rather than implying that a vav not connected to a verb is necessarily a, quote, vav copulative used disjunctively, that is a vav disjunctive, and necessarily exclude the possibility of gaps, as Fields and
Lyon
claim. In this case, common sense demands some kind of sequences, as the earth must be, quote, void and desolate after having been created in chapter 1 verse 1, if, as
Lyon
rightly argues, chapter 1 verse 1 is describing creation ex nihilo. So, while it's technically accurate to observe that the vav beginning chapter 1 verse 2 is a disjunctive, as Goldingay remarks, quote, I don't see how this proves anything about creationism, unquote. Vav is an extremely common Hebrew word, really a prefix to other words which may carry the meaning of and, or but, now, then, so forth, or even be untranslated, as it was by the New King James Version of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 to 2, effectively treating it as a punctuation. Other than in the very first sentence of chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, vav begins every sentence there. Further, while most scholars agree with
Lyon
that the vav beginning Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 is a disjunctive and so does not necessarily convey the meaning of a sequence of events, most would also say that the vav beginning chapter 1 verse 3 is a vav consecutive, which likely does convey a sequence. But is it an immediate sequence with no possibility of other events, no gaps, so immediate that the attached events must have occurred on the same day? Answers in Genesis, official spokesman Troy Lacey insists that it is. According to AIG, the vav consecutive, beginning chapter 1 verse 3, quote, really means something akin to and then next, unquote. Further, they say, quote, so it is revealed that all these events from chapter 1 verse 1 through chapter 1 verse 5 equal one day, verse 5, constrained by evening and morning, Therefore, at most, the time between the creative events of each day cannot be longer than 12 hours, for in verse 3, God created light. Had God wanted to convey a time period, some type of gap, between each day or any day, he would have surely done so by not having Moses connect everything with a vav consecutive, unquote. To his credit,
Lyon,
does not try to make this case of an immediate sequence of events based on the vav consecutive. AIG is right in the basic data they report. The vav consecutive means generally and then next, but then wrong in the way they interpret that data. They imply that the vav consecutive allows for no intervening events, as though it means and then immediately next. This is a rendering of vav not borne out by Hebrew usage or lexicons. It's simply not true. For example, in Genesis chapter 5, the genealogical entry of each name, beginning with Adam in verse 3 and following in verses 6, 9, and 12, begins with vav, translated as when in the ESV, a vav consecutive. Surely, though, we are not expected to believe that Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, and so forth did nothing other than father a son at the specified time, and there were no intervening events. Indeed, we're told each of them had other sons and daughters in the intervening time. The truth is that the vav consecutive only signifies the next event that the author wishes to narrate. Fields and Now
Lyon,
aren't so careless as AIG as to make inaccurate, sweeping claims about the vav consecutive. Rather, they ignore it. Despite relying on the disjunctive of chapter 1, verse 2 for his argument,
Lyon,
doesn't deal with the vav consecutive opening verse 3, the first word in the refrain, and God said. He doesn't mention the vav consecutive at all. This is a crucial omission because the vav consecutive beginning the first, and God said, in verse 3, can indeed allow for a gap between the original creation and the beginning of the days. Fields strove to prove that the opening vav of chapter 1, verse 2 cannot be a consecutive, that consecutives, not disjunctives, allow the possibility of a time interval. Hence, Fields and
Lyon,
have implicitly admitted that the vav consecutive beginning verse 3 may separate chapter 1, verses 1 to 2 from day 1, just as the vav consecutive separates each day from the one before. That is, the opening vav of chapter 1, verse 3 communicates a subsequent act in the same way as the vavs that begin every other day. Fields and
Lyon,
strove to close any possible gap between verse 1 and verse 2 based on their interpretation of the vav disjunctive. But in so doing, they appear to have proved the consecutive opening verse 3 with the refrain allows for a break in the sequence of events between verse 2 and verse 3. The sine qua non of YECism, young earth creationism, is demonstrating an unbroken, datable chronology back to the original creation. So, tying verse 2 to verse 3 is crucial. Young earth creationism seeks to link the original creation, in verse 1, to the first fiat, first command of day 1, in verse 3, through the events of verse 2. But that attempt founders on exactly the grammatical point Fields and
Lyon,
work so hard to prove to close the gap between verses 1 and 2. A vav consecutive, not a disjunctive, begins verse 3. They argue unpersuasively that the vav disjunctive opening verse 2 forbids any gap between in the beginning in verse 1 and God said in verse 3, but fail to note the vav consecutive opening verse 3 allows that gap. Grammar. This then begins the third major issue after the refrain and the vav regarding time in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 2. The grammar.
Lyon,
Claims that the, quote, straightforward interpretation of the verbs suggests that verses 1 and 2 are part of day 1. C. John Collins disagrees. He noted, quote, the likely function of Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 is to describe the conditions of the earth just as the first day was beginning in verse 3. So it says nothing about whether there was any time gap between the initial creation event in verse 1 and the first day. I argue this on the basis of discourse grammar, unquote. By discourse grammar, Collins means that the perfect tense in the opening of the narrative describes an event that occurred prior to the main narrative. Quote, the normal use of the perfect at the very beginning of a pericope, that is a set of verses that forms one coherent unit or thought suitable for public reading from a text, a distinct section that can be marked off from the rest, that's a pericope. Quote, the normal use of the perfect at the very beginning of a pericope is to denote an event that took place before the storyline gets underway, unquote. It's a stage-setting grammatical device.
Lyon,
Calls them katal verbs, apparently referring to the same thing, a past tense. The main storyline uses what Hebrew grammarians call weiktol verbs. Weiktol means and plus yiktol. For example, Wayomer, and he would say, and he said. To put it simplistically, it's a storytelling sense. In Genesis chapter 1, there are no weiktol, storytelling verbs, in the first two verses. The first two verses are katal verbs, which Collins explains are for, quote, stage setting. The first use of a weiktol verb, and thus the marker that the main narrative has begun, is at the onset of verse 3. And he said, Wayomer. The remainder of Genesis 1 contains these types of verbs. Hence, created, bara, in chapter 1, verse 1, quote, denotes an action prior to the main storyline, that is, prior to the beginning of the first day, unquote. Collins concludes, based on this discourse grammar, that day 1 begins in chapter 1, verse 3, at an unspecified time after the creation of the universe in verse 1.
Lyon,
His response is to claim that it is more, quote, natural to read the first two verses as part of day 1, and that it would, quote, seem to be a bit out of place, unquote, to begin the narrative with weiktol verbs. He explains that his reading is more natural. Quote, considering one of the primary, though not exclusive, functions of the weiktol is to move the narration forward sequentially, unquote. That the weiktol verbs beginning in verse 3 move the narration forward isn't the question. The question is, why doesn't verse 1 begin with such a verb if, as he argues, day 1 begins in verse 1? Why is the stage set for, and God said, if there is no stage prior to, and God said? He further explains, quote, and given there would have been no creative acts prior to the beginning, unquote. That is, he's saying verses 1 to 2 must be part of day 1 because there cannot be any acts before the, quote, absolute beginning, apparently assuming that day 1 is the absolute beginning.
Lyon,
Is begging the question of whether Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 2 is part of day 1. He says it is because that is, quote, the natural reading. In reality, it is quite natural to preface a narrative by setting the stage. In this case, setting the stage for the 6 days by briefly describing the events prior to the beginning of days. There are 4 stage-setting statements, one in verse 1 about the absolute beginning, and 3 in verse 2 focusing on the condition of the earth. First, and the earth was void and desolate. Second, and darkness was over the face of the deep. Third, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, the second part, and darkness is over the face of the deep, is closely connected to the first part because it borrows its verb, hayata, from it. Genesis chapter 1, the third part, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, may be interpreted as separable and so as an independent sentence, or the third part may be interpreted as having a participle, hovering, that assumes the verb of the first part, was or became, alongside it. Either way, the verb in the third part describes ongoing action, was hovering. To hover is dynamic, an action over some time. This word evokes the image of a hen brooding over her chicks. It suggests nurturing, care, supervision. The same word, hovering, is used in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 11, quote, like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions, unquote. And in Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 9, where the ESV and other translations renders it as shakes, it also suggests a process over a period of time. How long a period of time? The passage doesn't say. This brings us to 2 independent, though interwoven issues. First, whether the phrases of Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 2 are sequential or circumstantial. And second, whether the verb in chapter 1, verse 2, the first part, hayita, is properly translated as was or became. That is it, and the earth was void and desolate, or the earth became void and desolate. If they are sequential, they communicate a chain of events over time, a problem if the time is less than 24 hours. If they are circumstantial, they describe the environment of the action. A circumstantial clause describes the manner, circumstances, or conditions under which the main clause occurs. In other words, what are the circumstances going on as the events begin to unfold? They can theoretically be interpreted in 4 different ways: as sequential with hayita, as was, and the earth was void, or sequential with hayita as became, the earth then became, after something happened, void, or circumstantial with hayita as was, the earth was void, or even circumstantial with hayita as became, describing events prior to day 1 which brought about the circumstances on the dawn of that day. None of these possible interpretations establish
Lyon,
young earth creationist case. Some trouble it. A sequential interpretation of chapter 1, verses 1 to 2 could render the vavs as then and hayita in chapter 1, verse 2, the first part, as became. In other words, the earth became void, with the interpretation that it relates a series of events. The earth became void and desolate, and then darkness became over the waters, and then the Spirit of God nurtured the earth. This approach suggests that the earth was first created by the command, the fiat, of chapter 1, verse 1, and then it became void. It implies a cosmic catastrophe that befell the earth. Some gap theorists have filled this gap with speculation that tends to discredit the gap theory, speculation that
Lyon,
understandably pounces on. Lyon claims that this is impossible because the vav disjunctive, discussed above, and the grammar, quote, the form of the verb, hayita, which is not connected to the vav conjunction, cannot be construed as became in this context.
Lyon,
Asserts this conclusion on the basis of
Gesenius,
Hebrew grammar, published in 1910, but doesn't note that many other Hebrew grammarians don't concur. Barry Banstra notes that hayita could indeed be rendered as a, quote, material process and be translated as became, unquote, hence sequential, contrary to
Lyon,
This suggests that, quote, the earth went through a transformation, unquote.
Lyon,
Is eager to discredit this as an exegetical possibility because if the earth became void as a result of events after creation, but prior to day 1, the datable sequence of events on which young earth creationism relies is undone. In an email interview, Leslie Allen, my former Old Testament professor, noted the possibility of interpreting the 3 statements of chapter 1, verse 2 as, quote, circumstantial, and whether they are dependent or independent clauses. Independent clauses are separate sentences, as in the current major English translations of Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 2.
Lyon,
Wants us, as is traditional, to read the first 2 verses as circumstantial and as independent clauses. He concludes that chapter 1, verse 2 is, quote, a parenthetical description of the condition of the earth in its initial created state. Allen says that this is a definite possibility. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, quote, is generally interpreted as a nominal circumstantial clause with the verb, hayita, just functioning as a copula, a was, with the usual order of subject-predicate in a circumstantial clause, unquote. Wilhelm Genesius concurs. He believed that Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 is an example of haya, the root word, being used as a, quote, connecting word, what Allen calls a copula. The condition reported by haya is either, quote, contemporaneous with the principal events or continuing as a result of them, unquote. The relevant question for us then is, what are the principal events? The creation of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, or the and God said of verse 3? Paul Juan and Takemitsu Murako likewise interpreted haya as a copula, was, connecting the earth with void and desolate, describing the circumstances that developed out of verse 1. But in 1892, S.R. Driver insists that the Hebrew wasn't so rigid in its rules, especially about what is or not a circumstantial clause. Quote, emphasis or the love of variety is a factor, unquote. One must have a sense of the literary nature of the text. It's literature, not mathematics. Further, even if verse 2 is circumstantial, the circumstantial with haya may represent an act completed long before. Allen concludes, quote, there is no 100% proof rule as to whether Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 is sequential or circumstantial, unquote. In other words, Hebrew lacks an absolute rule on this grammatical issue. This opens the door to legitimately interpreting the verb in verse 2, hayata, as became in a temporal sequence. In other words, the earth became void because of something that happened, possibly. Some scholars want to read the first two verses as circumstantial, but as dependent clauses, hence like, quote, when God created the heavens and the earth in the beginning, it was without form, etc. Thus, reading it as a dependent clause follows Abraham ben Ezra, who died in 1167, and Solomon ben Isaac, who died in 1105. F.F. Bruce wrote that he was, quote, almost persuaded that the best translation of Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 3 was, in the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was waste and emptiness, and darkness on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovering on the face of the water. God said, let there be light, and there was light. Other mid-20th century scholars were more fully persuaded. While this would seem to bolster the conclusion
Lyon
arrives at, nevertheless,
Lyon
helpfully commits several pages in his essay countering this dependent clause interpretation. Francis Anderson both interprets hayata as became and concludes chapter 1 verse 2 is circumstantial, but describing the circumstances arising out of verse 1, the aftermath of the original creation, not necessarily the circumstances of day one, as Collins suggested. Further, and to complicate matters, it is a circumstantial that describes a sequence of events, effectively both circumstantial and sequential. Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, quote, is a circumstantial sentence comprised of three conjoined circumstantial clauses, the whole circumstantial to the opening time in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, unquote. As circumstantial clauses with the perfect verb haya, Anderson compared the use of chapter 1 verse 2 with Genesis chapter 7 verse 6, quote, when the flood came, or in chapter 7 verse 10, the flood came, and in Exodus chapter 1 verse 5, and Joseph was already in Egypt. In these cases, haya represents a circumstance that was the result of a series of prior events over an extended time. So Anderson considers it more likely that the meaning is, quote, the earth had become or had come to be as a circumstance to the preceding verse, the creation of verse 1. Hence, Anderson concludes that while verse 2 is circumstantial, it describes circumstances that are the product of a sequence of events issuing from the original creation of verse 1, prior to the first fiat in verse 3. This issue of sequential versus circumstantial is directly relevant to whether Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 is interpreted as a title to the rest of the creation account or as the initial statement of it. Bruce Waltke defended the proposition that it is a title, hence a framing phrase summarizing the entire passage, in a three-part series of articles in Bibliotheca Sacra. John MacArthur follows him, quote, verse 1 is a general statement, unquote. MacArthur's position seems to be that Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 is a summary in advance, like a title, and the events themselves are described beginning in verse 2 with day 1. The most obvious problem with this interpretation is that there is then no statement of the creation of the earth. Where did the earth that is void and desolate, the deep and the waters, come from? Even if verse 1 is a title, it's still proven that day 1 dawns in verse 2. Because of the three statements there, before the and God said, demarcating each day. John Sailhammer argues in Genesis Unbound that beginning in verse 1 is not a title to the following account, but God's original creating act.
Lyon,
concurs, comparing verses 1 to 3 to Genesis chapter 2, verses 4 to 7, and mustering an impressive grammatical case to the conclusion that, quote, the arguments in favor of the summary statement view of verse 1 are unpersuasive and appear to be forced onto the text, unquote. Further, he notes the crucial issue is whether verse 2 describes conditions or events prior to day 1. The point of contention, he says, is whether the earth was created void or whether it became that way after some process. Again,
Lyon,
helpfully frames the discussion around the critical issues. Hence, there are two interwoven, overlapping issues, whether verses 1 to 2 is sequential or circumstantial, and whether hayita should be translated as was or became. Became suggests a sequential interpretation and would make the young earth creationist position difficult, as it would require the text to say the earth became void within day 1 before God said, let there be light. But translating it as was and interpreting it as circumstantial doesn't necessarily help young earth creationism or bolster
Lyon,
case. Anderson interprets it as sequential, like
Lyon,
but writes that verse 2 describes the state of the universe after creation, like Collins, setting the scene for the days. Hence, quote, the first event is reported in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, unquote, day 1. That's according to Anderson. Vocabulary. Sailhammer essentially concludes the same with Allen and Collins against
Lyon,
coming at it from another perspective, that of vocabulary, especially reshit, beginning. Sailhammer writes reshit, that's beginning, always refers to an extended yet indeterminate duration of time, not a specific moment. He notes Job chapter 8, verse 7, Genesis chapter 10, verse 10, and Jeremiah chapter 28, verse 1, using reshit in just this way. It is a, quote, time before time, not referring to a point in time, but a period of duration of time which falls before a series of events. It says that God created the universe during the intermediate period of time before the actual reckoning of a sequence of time began, unquote. It is then, in Collins' terms, stage setting. Similarly,
Gesenius,
noting the preposition in, prefixed to reshit, that normally such nouns with prepositions, in other words, quote, specifications compounded with a presupposition, unquote, stand after the verb, except, among other exceptions, quote, presuppositional specifications of time, unquote, citing Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. If, then, Bereshit, in the beginning, is the specification of time, then why would the same event, according to young earth creationists, have another specification of time, namely day 1? That is,
according to Lyon,
Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5 is one event all occurring on day 1. If so, why does it have two separate specifications of time? Also, Sailhammer believes that bara, or created, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, refers to an indefinite period of time, which, quote, could have spanned as much as several billion years, or it could have been much less. The text simply does not tell us how long. It tells us only that God did it during the beginning of our universe's history, unquote. Young earth creationist Ken Ham calls this a, quote, modified gap theory, and concludes that, quote, accepting billions of years is the real motive of Sailhammer's exegesis, noting, quote, Sailhammer proposes his idea in order to squeeze long ages into the text, unquote. Ham doesn't explain how he is able to discern Sailhammer's, quote, real motive. Ham exclaims, quote, no one in his right mind would believe this. It's not even in the Bible. Neither Ham nor
Lyon,
who cites Sailhammer's work and his conclusions, meaningfully engages Sailhammer's claims on vocabulary. Intertextual commentary.
Lyon,
Turns to Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, and chapter 31, verse 17 as, quote, intertextual commentary. That is, other passages of Scripture elaborating on creation. Quote, indicating that the initial creation of the heavens and the earth in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 is part of day 1 of creation week. However, Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, and chapter 31, verse 17, in the context of giving the theological basis for the fourth commandment, do not say God created, bara, the earth in 6 days. They say he made, yasa, it. Admittedly, there is a great deal of overlap in the semantic range of the two words, bara and yasa, create and make, just as with the English words that they are rendered as. They can sometimes be synonyms, as they are both sometimes translated by the Greek word
poieo.
in the Septuagint. In the Septuagint, bara is rendered by
Poieo.
in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, but by egneto, were made, in chapter 2, verse 4. In chapter 2, verse 4, the Septuagint translators had the opportunity to translate both words into the same Greek word if they believed that the two terms were interchangeable. They did not. So it's unclear whether the Septuagint translators regarded the two terms as always synonymous. In order to show that Exodus chapter 20, verse 11 sums up all of Genesis 1, including chapter 1, verses 1 to 2, and not just the days starting in verse 3,
Lyon.
must show that make, yasa, is exactly, always, synonymous with create, bara. He does not deal at all with this issue. Although
Lyon.
frequently compares verse 1 with chapter 2, verse 4, which summarizes the creation with both verbs, created, bara, and made, yasa, he doesn't comment on whether there is a difference in the semantic range between the two terms. This is another crucial omission. While often synonymous, the key question for
Lyon's
use of, quote, intertextual commentary to make Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 2 part of the days is whether create, bara, has a meaning outside the range of make, yasa. C.F. Kyle believes that it does. Quote, in call, that's the verb form of bara, always means to create and is only applied to a divine creation, the production of that which had no existence before. That is, create, bara, refers to God's creation out of nothing, ex nihilo. Brown Driver Briggs defines bara as shape, create, noting that it is, quote, always of divine activity, unquote. Besides Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it is used of the creation of the heavens of the earth, the universe, in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18, of humanity, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, and chapter 5, verse 1, and following, chapter 6, verse 7, and Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 32, and Psalm 89, verse 48, Isaiah chapter 45, verse 12, and Malachi chapter 2, verse 10, of the great sea creatures and of every living creature, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 21, of a clean heart, and Psalm 51, verse 12, of the north and the south, in Psalm 89, verse 13, of a cloud and fire over Zion, in Isaiah chapter 4, verse 5, of the host, in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 26, of the ends of the earth, in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 28, of transformed nature, in Isaiah chapter 41, verse 20, of the heavens, of Isaiah chapter 42, verse 5, of Israel, in Isaiah chapter 43, verses 1 and 7 and 15, of salvation and righteousness, in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 8, of the smith and the ravager, in Isaiah chapter 54, verse 16, of the fruit of lips, in Isaiah chapter 57, verse 19, of a new heaven and earth and new Jerusalem, in Isaiah chapter 65, verse 17 and following, of new things, like the ground swallowing up the Korahites, in Numbers chapter 60, verse 30, or a woman encircling a man, in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 22, of wind, in Amos chapter 4, verse 13, and so forth. That's bara. Meanwhile, the verb in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, yasa, translated as make, is defined with two primary meanings, do or make. Besides Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, both terms are used in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, making, yasa, peace, and creating, bara, evil. The question, though, is whether create can have a meaning outside the range of make. It can. Create, bara, is only used in the Old Testament with God as its subject, whereas make, yasa, is not so specific. If chapter 1, verse 1 is describing creation ex nihilo, then create, bara, is the proper term. If chapter 1, verse 3 to chapter 2, verse 3 is describing God working on the earth already created in verse 1, then make, yasa, is the proper term. So chapter 2, verse 4 summarizes both the creation ex nihilo of verse 1 and the making of a habitable earth in the 7 days in parallelism. If Exodus chapter 20, verse 11 was meant to be interpreted to encompass the entire creation from the beginning in verse 1, then bara would have been the proper term, but it uses yasa, the making of something out of pre-existing material. Therefore, Exodus chapter 20, verse 11 can legitimately be interpreted as to only summarize Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 to chapter 2, verse 3, the main storyline, not necessarily the 4 scene-setting statements of the first 2 verses. Given the context of Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, which is the 4th commandment about the Sabbath day, the specific reference to make, yasa, is to the 7 days. To assume that those 7 days include the creating of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 to 2, is to beg the question this essay is written to answer. Conclusion. Beginning at the beginning.
Lyon.
And other young earth creationists have not shown a sound exegetical basis to claim that Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 to 2 is part of day 1. The literary marker of the beginning of day 1, as with each of the other days, is the refrain, "And God said." Day 1 is thus marked as beginning in verse 3. That the same phrase is also used of 3 other significant creation events besides the dawning of new days doesn't detract from its function as a literary signal, like a rooster crow, that a new day has begun. Hence, absolute creation occurred at an unspecified time before day 1. Whether the earth was or became void and desolate is debatable, but Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, the 3rd part, tells us that for an unspecified span of time, the Spirit of God was hovering or hovered over the water on earth. All of this occurred prior to the first "and God said," the green light that starts each day. At this point, as far as dating the earth from the Bible, the meaning of the days is moot. Whether the days are literal 24-hour days or long eras or a literary framework is quite beside the point for dating the creation from Scripture. Genesis simply does not provide the unbroken chronological chain back to creation ex nihilo. So, as John Lennox observed, the beginning of Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 is not dated to day 1 as many assume. The initial creation happened before day 1. How long before? Genesis does not tell us. So quite apart from the input of science, without the pressure of the modern academic consensus, based purely on exegesis, that is, interpretation of the Bible, from the text of Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 to 3, we conclude that by separating the absolute beginning, in verse 1, from day 1, verse 3, the Bible leaves the age of the universe undisclosed.
Jeremy D. Lyon.
Contributed scholarly work seeking to tie the first 2 verses to day 1 in a way that closes the door on the possibility of any time before day 1 and thus bolstering the exegetical case of young earth creationism. He's helpfully focused on the most crucial matter in the debate, whether the first 2 verses are prior to day 1. His work is substantially better than that of much of popular young earth creationism, which often concentrates on strained interpretations of the conjunction vav and skips to a literalistic interpretation of day as though that was the crucial issue. In so doing, he's made some helpful contributions, such as defending the traditional interpretation of Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 to 2 as independent clauses rather than the dependent clause interpretation that was in vogue among some 20th century scholars. However, despite his subjective claims that his, quote, traditional interpretation is, quote, natural and straightforward, his failure to deal substantially with the "and God said" refrain, demarcating the beginning of each day, the scene-setting grammar and vocabulary of the first 2 verses, the vav consecutive beginning verse 3, and the differing semantic ranges of create and make, means that
Lyon
fails to prove his case. So our undoctrinated reader would not find Lyon's interpretation natural or straightforward. Such a reader likely would not assume that the first 2 verses are part of day 1. The Bible doesn't begin with day 1. It begins with an absolute creation, ex nihilo, that sets the stage for the 7 days. So, until young earth creationism can show that the creation occurred on day 1, Young Earth creationism dogmatism is also ex nihilo.